Limbus Company is a game that doesn't have much content. Every 2 weeks we get an ID or ego banner, usually with 1 ID, 2 only if we've been good children in the eyes of Jolly Saint Jihoon, and very rarely some actual content that isn't reruns, and even then, sometimes that's the best we can ask for. But this video isn't about the lack of permanent game modes, it's about those ID banners, since those have been the most consistent thing in the game from the very beginning. So what happens if, theoretically, it just so happens that a lot of those ID banners in a short period of time have IDs on them that you despise? I'm being a bit hyperbolic, but the answer is you get a partial explanation for my abysmal upload schedule as of late, sorry about that, and also you get to the main point of this video. I do not like the Heishou IDs. And since Season 6 is coming to a close, meaning that we're not getting any more of them for at least a little while, hopefully, I want to spend the next however many minutes it says down there going over everything I think went wrong with this infamous faction of IDs. But before going any further, a few disclaimers. Firstly, this video will contain spoilers for basically all of Limbus Company up to Spring Cultivation in some way, not just Canto 8. So if you somehow skipped through a previous Kanto but read Kanto 8 and 8.5, you're weird, and also you should not watch this video. Secondly, this video is entirely my own opinion, and I apologize profusely in advance to the poor people online who will be told that they're just parroting my opinion on the Heishou IDs after this video goes live, but more importantly, my opinion isn't meant to shit on people who enjoy using the Heishou. Limbus is a game where you're allowed to do whatever you want, and fun is the priority above all, even if it means you're playing the game wrong, and I fucking hate you for it. Okay, I feel like I've been super dramatic so far, and for what, really? 9 IDs that were released over an 8-month period? What is it about the Heishou IDs in particular that has me and many other people so upset? To answer that question, I think it's best to go down the line. From the start with the Mao Branch Ryoshu and Mao Branch Otis IDs, all the way to you Adept Heathcliff and Wei Branch Don Quixote. However, to be as fair as I possibly can, and to prevent this video from being entirely doom and gloom, don't worry, there'll be plenty of that, I'll be listing the things I like about the specific Heishou IDs before I talk about the things I dislike, because it's pretty hard for Project Moon to make an ID I completely despise in every single way, especially nowadays, where basically none of these are genuinely dead on arrival gameplay-wise. So we must naturally start at the catalyst of human suffering, the only 2 Heishou IDs not released within Season 6, despite absolutely being Season 6 IDs in spirit. Mao Ryoshu and Otis were pretty innocuous for their time. In fact, I gave my flowers to them in my video reviewing every single ID. They were extremely new at the time, of course, but I found their kits to be relatively unique among Rupture units, and much needed to help bolster a Rupture team that was starting to feel stagnant. Notice my emphasis of at the time, since that is doing a lot of heavy lifting. Also, I'll be doing this a few times throughout the video, but I have to address the art on a good chunk of these IDs, especially Mao Ryoshu's Up-Tai 1 art. And as an artist of a similar caliber to those working on Limbus's art myself, I appreciate the contrast of Ryoshu's eyes compared to everything else around her especially. Lastly, I was very iffy on these IDs in terms of why they went to Ryoshu and Otis specifically, since most IDs have a good reason to go to their respective sinners, and I thought these 2 fell flat for a long time. However, after sifting through their ID stories again, I have to admit that the idea of these 2 sinners, whose memories of their loved ones or family are so important to them, being stuck in a Heishou branch that wipes away individuality and those memories of the past, is quite fitting. That's where my legally mandated list of positive things to say ends though, and really, it's partially because they are such unfortunate victims of later circumstances. However, we'll talk about that when we get to the other bunny-type Heishou. Because, much more importantly, these IDs are the first time I have ever mistaken 2 IDs for each other consistently, even to this very day sometimes. Think about any 2 non-Heishou IDs from the same faction, and try to imagine how those IDs look with just their silhouette. Most times, a sinner's hair is enough to make their silhouette distinct from another sinner in the same faction. And if that is not enough, their poses or weapon are also usually quite varied. This is absolutely not the case with these two. Yes, Otis is looking at her watch and has a darker skin tone than Ryoshu, and Ryoshu's sword adds some red accents, but let me tell you, that hardly matters when you just look at the silhouette or when you're actually in battle. This may seem like a very minor nitpick, but I cannot stress enough that there are no other IDs in the game that remotely have this problem. So it's a real sore point for me, especially in a game that's generally praised for having excellent character designs. It's not even just appearances though. When looking at their skills side by side, they're extremely similar except some slight number differences, and Ryoshu wanting to win clashes, and Otis wanting to go unopposed. In theory, this is a good way to make these two distinct from each other in gameplay. But in regular encounters, you have next to no control over this, meaning their strengths and weaknesses are nullified, leaving two IDs that are essentially the exact same in a few too many ways for me to call acceptable. Let's have a look at two IDs that also seem pretty similar on the surface, Liu Ishmael and Liu Roja. Same coin spreads, same status, faction, and while the numbers on Roja are better, that's just how it goes on an ID released 7 months after Ishmael. However, even these IDs deviate heavily from each other with their skill 3 gimmicks, with Ishmael looking to stagger or kill an enemy with the final coin, while Liu Roja spends some burn count to get some instant gratification damage that's not all that gratifying because it's capped at 30. Not to mention Roja's attempt at being a Liu faction team leader. What are Ryoshu and Otis's passives in comparison? I mean, seriously? Is this a joke? But that's good. I can already hear your keyboard clacking into my comment section. The point of the Heishou IDs is that they are not distinct from each other, just like the actual Heishou. I'm sure you thought you were really clever for that one. For what it's worth, it is an absolutely valid and correct point, which begs a very obvious question. Why the hell are there two of them? If the Heishou as a concept eventually lead to the argument of they are not meant to be unique from one another, then why are we getting two of the same ID? To prove that point? I'd say the point is plenty proven within the story itself, and further reinforced with all of the following Heishou IDs too. I think basically wasting an ID release slot for this is overkill. If that was even the intention to begin with, which, I don't know, I'm not Kim Ji-hoon. And for my next trick, let's look at the context in which these IDs were released and ways this problem could have potentially been prevented. The Mao IDs were released in 7.5.2, aka Nocturnal Sweeping, the intervallo leading into the Surrendered Witnessing. And yes, the Heishou are quite prominent here. If we're being specific, the Mao Heishou ambush Limbus Company, and the C Heishou assassinate Mr. Swept Away guy. However, there's also the Sweepers and the Middle. And while I know a lot of people wanted Sweeper IDs, I think it would have been far better for the Middle to have gotten an actual seasonal ID during this intervallo. Would it have spoiled the fact that Ricardo was going to return? I mean, they already had him as an announcer and put him on the fucking map before you actually fight him on the node, which is still one of the dumbest choices I have ever seen Project Moon make, so it's safe to say they didn't care to hide his return all that much. And you might be thinking that the Middle actually did get a seasonal ID release for 7.5.2 in Middle Sinclair, and yeah, you would think he was seasonal, but he isn't for some reason. Really though. If they needed to have two Heishou to get released in this intervallo, a CID actually makes enough sense here, since they have an actual presence in the story, which I am using loosely since it just comes at the end of it, but they do essentially end one of the main conflicts, so I'll count it. This eliminates the issue of releasing two IDs that are so similar at the exact same time. And what a perfect transition that is into the two C Branch IDs, released alongside Part 1 of Kanto 8, 2 months after the Mao IDs on May 15th, 2025. It's important to mention that since we'll talk about it later, but first, let me talk about what I like about C Roja, and that is the very thing I criticized with Mao Ryoshu and Otis. The Heishou are not special. What is the one thing Roja wants above all? Some sense of purpose. Something to grasp onto to justify her existence, something that makes her special. And this ID is a dead end. Even the people Roja is sent to cut down in her Uptai story mock her after she complains about her misery to them, saying, quote, "How dare a mere beast of the Heishou lecture us? You're nothing more than livestock." And while I couldn't agree more with the second part of what this person says, it's no doubt the most devastating words someone like Roja could hear, especially when she's unable to refute them. She even tries to cope later on, saying, "I'm so glad I'm a Heishou when stuff's going down for reals. We get a brief period to relax once they pick the family hierarch too, don't we?" It was as though something had taken control of my tongue to speak, as though all the gloom in my words were cleaned and filtered before leaving my lips. If I admit that I desire for nothing more than to escape this life as a Heishou, I'll have to face what a miserable thing I've become. It gets even sadder when she tries and fails to get Gregor to validate her, claiming there will be a super capable snake-sized hole when she's gone, only to be met with what is essentially an apathetic meh from Gregor in return. This Uptai story is absolutely fantastic. One of the better ones at showing us one of the sinners in their lowest moments, in one of the worst scenarios they could be in specifically, and even that doesn't stop me from absolutely hating the C Branch Heishou, perhaps the most out of all 9 of them. You might have noticed I didn't say anything else nice about Roja or anything nice about Gregor, and that's because I cannot think of a single other thing I like enough about them here. Yes, they do not look identical like Ryoshu and Otis, but literally no other IDs in the game have that problem. And their kits aren't the same either. Also because very few IDs in the game have that problem. Everything I like about them is just the fact that they don't really have the same problems as the Mao. Their problem is that there is absolutely zero justifiable reason for these IDs to even exist when they did in the first place. What I mean by that is that the C Branch Heishou should have never started off Season 6, and by extension, Kanto 8. You'll have to bear with me for this, but let's look at every single set of IDs that have started off a season. Season 1 technically shouldn't count, but I'll put G. Gregor and G. Otis in there on a semi-technicality, since that definitely would have been the very first banner, along with Rose Spanner Roja and Merceau for Season 2, LCCB Ryoshu and Pirate Gregor for Season 3, Dead Rabbit's Boss Merceau and Butler Otis for Season 4, Sank Merceau and Zwei Sinclair for Season 5, and of course, these guys. Going down the line, the G-Corp IDs are based on the most prominent enemies throughout all of Kanto 1, with Otis being based on a character with a sprite and speaking lines, and Gregor either being based on Toma or just being a bad ending for him. Season 2 is the weakest besides Season 6, because I feel very similarly about the Rose Spanners as I do about the Heishou, since their story impact is very low. But Roja is based on Nico, who does speak and shows up in Part 1 of Kanto 4, and Merceau is a 2-star ID based on a grunt in the same faction. Season 3 starts the trend of 2 different factions who both are featured in Part 1 of their Kanto, with Ryoshu being based on Pilot, who appears near the end of Part 1 of Kanto 5, and Gregor being based on Smee, the main antagonist of sorts and final boss in Kanto 5's first third. Dead Rabbit's Boss Merceau and Butler Otis are based on Matt and Josephine respectively, and while Josephine is obvious and makes sense, Dead Rabbit's Boss Merceau is a really clever choice for a Part 1 ID, since we think we see him in Part 1, but he's never actually featured, only mentioned, since the person we believe to be Matt is revealed to be Heathcliff last name ? It's a great way to give insight into a character who was only mentioned by name, but is still absolutely relevant to the plot and to Heathcliff within the mirror world. Season 5 admittedly does blunder, considering Sank Merceau is based on the devil himself, but Zwei Sinclair is based on Paula, a character who speaks, has a sprite, and has an interesting dynamic with him. You might be wondering why I've emphasized the characters these IDs are based on having sprites and speaking. Pop quiz time. What do the C Branch Heishou do in Kanto 8 Part 1? I think that's enough time to think, because they do nothing. Bonus question, what do they do in Kanto 8 Part 2? Yeah. This is the first, and hopefully only time, that Part 1 IDs to a Kanto have had no direct relevance to the story in some way, since I guess Rose Spanner Merceau, and he was a 2-star. Both of these are 3-star IDs, meaning there is no excuse for either of them. You might think I'm done with the Heishou section because I literally just said they have no justification to exist, but no. Because the issue is they could have so easily been justified in 2 different ways. 1, make one of them release in Nocturnal Sweeping, like I said, ideally Roja, of course, since I like her Uptie story, but it doesn't really matter which one. Not like she's all that special anyways, right? And this is even easier, though the less impactful option. Number 2, literally just give them poison. I don't care that it's reskinned burn, they're snakes, for fuck's sake. And the fact they're just poise rupture hybrids means that on top of having 0 reason to exist, they fall flat of the most basic concept they could have fulfilled. I'm still not done though, because there's a secret 3rd option to justify their existence, and that would be putting them in Spring Cultivation, where they at least would finally appear as actual enemies, instead of in just 1 CG in Nocturnal Sweeping, or via dialogue boxes at the very end of Canto 8, consisting of 2 lines of the most generic dialogue I have ever read. And despite all of that, even in the perfect scenario where they're a poison ID that are released in Nocturnal Sweeping, I still wouldn't really want them as IDs, because there's not a single prominent member of their branch, unlike the Mao and the Wu branch. But I guess at least these guys get generic grunt enemies and some dialogue, which is somehow better than some of the other Heishou. Still, in my opinion, it doesn't get much worse than these 2. Since the only thing I like about either of them is one of their Uptie stories, and they take up an otherwise very well-handled and valuable slot for a seasonal ID, that being the very first of the season, generally setting the tone of what to expect going forward, or at least just consisting of characters you can expect to see within the Kanto they're meant to be teasing for you. They're failures. Completely and utterly, and their ID slot really should have been taken by some Jupan ID, but instead we got trash. And now we go from the most unjustifiable Heishous to one of only 2 Heishou IDs I will give a genuine pass to. Mao Branch Adept Faust is based on Zilu. And Zilu, despite not being given much actual characterization until Spring Cultivation, is a character with a sprite and dialogue. It's crazy how that seems like a relief compared to the C branch, huh? I don't have a lot of good things to say about Mao Faust outside of that, but just bear in mind that me saying she deserves existence is a really big compliment. And it's also just unfortunate that the first negative to bring up is that Mao Faust killed God and many other fun things, and by God, I of course mean Talisman Sinclair, who died for Mao Faust's sins. But also, let me be very clear, he definitely needed to die at some point. Mao Faust was the nail in the coffin for Talisman Sinclair, as she kinda was for a lot of stuff, actually. This was the ID that made Ji-hoon attempt one last time to nerf an ID post-release, and bless his widowed dog boy heart, he just couldn't do it. He absolutely should have, though. It's not a secret this ID was extremely strong on release and continues to be great now, but she was so good that she basically made the rest of the Heishou IDs lose an entire gimmick. The initial 2 Maos had Deathrite Haste, the C Heishou brought in Deathrite Venom, and Faust had Haste, but also introduced Deathrite Fissure. And despite 3 more Heishou branches releasing after Faust, none of them would have a Deathrite again. Because Faust's Tianjiu Star's Blade built up based on activation of Deathrite effects and allowed her to use her Empowered Skill 3, and the amount to activate this Empowered Skill 3 was the thing Project Moon wanted to nerf, but didn't go through with. This of course meant that if any more Deathrites were to exist, it would be even easier to make Mao Faust shoot these off even faster. I'd even argue that Lord of Hongguan Honglu himself was likely planned to have Deathrites be a focus of his kit. like Kong Chu. But this was removed once they realized she was too good. That part is speculation, but it's pretty fair to say that at the very least, Mao Faust made Project Moon very alert about how strong Rupture was getting. And if making it so that the Heishous had to swerve away from one of their initial faction gimmicks wasn't enough, this ID has led to the Mao Branch taking up 1/3 of all of the Heishou IDs. Bear in mind, we have 9 total now, and there are 12 branches. At the time, there were already 5 Heishou IDs, 3/5 of which were Mao, with only 1/6 of all total branches represented. Now, I do not personally think that each Heishou branch needed representation, but when I think about it, I guess I would have preferred it to what we ended up with. Perhaps the biggest issue with Mao Faust piggybacks off of that same problem of her being a Mao. Now, Mao Ryoshu and Mao Otis were even less unique. Take a look at all of their skill 1s. Ryoshu and Faust have the exact same skill 1 except for the Sin Affinity, something I don't think can be said for any other 2 IDs in the game. And the Heishou are meant to be similar argument hardly applies here because she's a frickin' Adept. Her skill 3 and assist defense gimmick are different enough, but there's another issue becoming apparent when we look at the kits for all 5 of the Heishou released by this second banner of Kanto 8, and that is they all play very similarly. They want to use their skill 3 or defense skill to gain their respective 3-turn buff, and then either play into their death right in the case of the Mao, or just use their skill 3 in the case of the C. And you know what? I'm going to be even a bit meaner to Mao Faust, because I think she could have maybe been released at a better time. That time being during Spring Cultivation alongside Wu Branch Song. And instead, we could have gotten some family hierarch candidate IDs, like, Zhupan, the consistent recurring antagonist besides Kong Chu or the N-Corp gang, or if we couldn't do that, then Jichun Ishmael a week earlier. And speaking of Jichun Ishmael, remember what I said about Mao Faust making Project Moon very alert about Rupture getting too strong? Yeah. I think Jichun Ishmael was the direct consequence of that, since she released right after Mao Faust, and it feels like they overcorrected for her in Jichun Ishmael's kit. And even if that wasn't the case, she was underpowered in nearly every way on release compared to the stupid no-name Heishou and one actual character who hadn't even been fleshed out yet. Let me say that again to really emphasize how terrible it is. Jichun, one of very few characters to be in multiple cantos and intervalos besides the Sinners of course, had her one ID immediately outshone by no-name grunts or not much better Zilu, who had significantly less story presence. This point against the Heishou is definitely less solid, and more so an excuse to be sad about how just okay Jichun Ishmael is. Mao Adept Faust is fine. I find her to be kind of bland, though a lot of my actual issues with her come from the fact that she was a pretty clear misstep in terms of balance, leading to a ripple effect that I speculate led to the removal of a gimmick and the nerfing of an ID I was genuinely excited for, so I can't say I'm too big of a fan of her either way. Luckily, Wu Branch Yisong, or Wei Yisong, which is a bit confusing considering there's a Wei branch that doesn't have Wei in it, but I digress. Wei Yisong is the best Heishou easily in my opinion. He's not the strongest of the bunch, sadly, far from it, mostly being a good Tremor ID rather than more insane Rupture support or really high damage, which, to clarify, I think is a good thing, but it's still unfortunate he feels somewhat forgotten about, probably in part due to synergizing with Jichun Ishmael, who just isn't really worth it. Either way though, I really like his Uptie 1 art, and this is the first Heishou that properly leaned into the animal themings of the Heishou. The Mao Branch IDs, despite having 3 of them, had very little physical indication of them being bunnies. They're fast and have bunny tails. Cool, I guess. The CIDs just looked diseased and had a stretchy arm, which is, fun, sure. but they don't even poison you, so what's the point? But Yi Song, like Wild Hunt Heathcliff before him, can horse out, and in a much more literal way compared to Wild Hunt 2. Horse mogging aside, Wei Yi Song is the first and only Heishou that I have actively wanted. Kinda. I wanted Wei Yi Song since he was teased in Jichun Ishmael's Up Taiwan art, and while this is Wei Yi Song, it is Wei in his Heishou form, which we do see in Spring Cultivation, but I would have slightly preferred regular Wei to go alongside Jichun Ishmael. That's a pretty small complaint in the grand scheme of things, and I've been really harsh on the past, every Heishou, so I'll take the chance here to say this now. I don't think the Heishou shouldn't have existed as a faction overall. Here is a great example of it being done right in basically every way. No pun intended. The Uptai story is similarly tragic to Rodion, since it follows Yi Song coping with the execution of Ji Ishmael, and returning to his natural role leading the Wu branch as an adept. It's not quite as compelling as Rodion's, but it's definitely way more interesting than Otis's, Ryoshu's, or especially C. Gregor's, since it's a glimpse into what could have happened to Wei if he lost his way and fell on the wayside. I feel a little bad not having more to say, just because I like Wu Branch Yi Song, and I think he is a well-made ID and relatively well-rounded gameplay-wise. However, it's almost always easier to say negative things rather than nice things, and in that case, these next two will have plenty of material. Okay, positive things first. We'll stay positive. The U branch is probably my favorite Heishou branch aesthetically and animation-wise, though the competition isn't very stiff, and Burn is one of my favorite archetypes. Heathcliff's probably a better done self-burn ID than Ardor Blossom Faust, because he doesn't fucking kill himself, on top of being pretty fun and strong, and both of their Uptai 3 arts are eye candy. Did I hit my positivity quota? Hopefully, because although I had a surprising amount of nice things to say, I have to ask a very important question. Why do these IDs exist? Unlike the C branch, who at least showed up as enemies and had dialogue at some point, these stupid birds, as far as I could find, only appeared for one dialogue box during Canto 8 Part 2's finale to pull Dayu out of danger. And if that is meant to be the justification for them being IDs, why was Sinclair released during Spring Cultivation and Heathcliff just randomly instead of during the Canto itself? Well, I know Sinclair is probably just because he was heavily featured in Spring Cultivation and literally just funny chicken reference for Sinclair, but this guy was more unsolicited than pictures of little Yu Heishous being sent to an attractive person's DMs. Okay, maybe that's a bit of an exaggeration, but in a tier list of relevance in the story, the U branch is somehow not dead last, but is a strong second to last place. I actually wouldn't mind this as much if it didn't seem like Project Moon was kinda trying to make IDs for branches that would actually do something in the story at some point, but then the Sinclair U branch ID felt like a response to the demand for more Heishou branches, which, okay, fair. And then immediately, Yu Heathcliff spat in the face of that idea, doubling up on an already irrelevant existing branch. So I really don't understand what they were trying to do here. Now, this isn't even mentioning the fact that Sinclair sucks. It's not his numbers or anything. His skill 2 is actually pretty good in particular. His burn application is, it's there. But this ID has some Season 1 ass jank. This passive, Let's Get Battle Drunk, which just reminds everyone that we could have had a proper Night Drifter ID for Sinclair instead, also has this line in it. Combat End. If this unit has Burn, gain 1 Blood Flame, 1 Wrath damage up, and 1 Gluttony damage up at the next turn start. Okay, first of all, the U branch having their unique effect be called Blood Flame, despite not inflicting bleed at all, is just awesome. And secondly, let's look at the ways Yu Claire can get burnt. Okay, so there's actually only 2 of them, and one of them is losing a clash on his skill 3. That's probably just for flavor, why would you ever want to do that? And losing a clash with his clashable counter. both of which, by the way, only apply to burn same turn to himself and his target, with no burn count, meaning this passive effect activates one time if you were to lose a clash with your skill 3 or counter. A Wrath damage up and Gluttony damage up are absolutely not worth missing out on an entire skill's worth of damage, so what about Blood Flame? Well, Blood Flame has a max stack of 3, and that's all I need to say. It doesn't matter what it does, because if you lose the clash with your clashable counter, you already gain 3 Blood Flame on use the next turn. Guess what you need to do to lose a clash? You gotta use the skill. Meaning this effect is worthless unless you specifically lose the clash with your skill 3, or, of course, get burn applied to you some other way. So at best, this passive activates when you lose a clash with your counter on accident, and then you use it to empower your skill 3, which is now also a bit stronger because you took a hit due to the missing HP conditional. I didn't want this video to be about gameplay. Lord knows someone's covered all of these IDs multiple times in my absence, but this aspect of you, Sinclair, is just so stupidly designed, and I really don't like when there's half-assed mechanics or ideas within ID kits like this, especially since it means that you, Sinclair, is yet another counter into skill 3 Heishou ID, though admittedly he can also use his skill 2 for a big payoff. It's still a counter first turn and whenever you don't have your respective status ID. Heathcliff fully commits to the self-damage to deal more damage gimmick and is way better off for it, but it also makes me worry that Sinclair was intentionally made this way so that Heathcliff the Adept could shine brighter, especially since Sinclair was a welfare ID, but that's completely speculative. In some weird way, I guess I am glad Adept Heathcliff exists, for the sole fact that he has needed a burn ID since forever. But I feel like we really could have gone without another U-Branch Heishou, or another Heishou ID in general, of course. But if we had to get one U Heishou at all, I don't know why it wasn't just Heathcliff. Because as much as I hate to admit it, I do take some heavy guilty pleasure in this guy's animations. And lastly, a Rupture Sinking Don Quixote ID that uses blunt skills, released in Season 6. What a unique concept. Look, I get it. She's so cute and scrunkly. Just wanna pinch her cheeks or something, and not everyone has love and hate Don Quixote. The fact she has goat eyes instead of human, or blood fiend eyes is a neat detail, but sorry, I could not care less about this ID. She follows the Heishou formula of clashable counter to gain thing to do more damage than skill 3. The only kind of cool thing is her having the 7 Otis gimmick where she does extra damage of a different damage type than what she has, but W. Heathcliff did it before her in the same season, so... Look, I don't like repeating myself, but I do hope that this long-winded review of all of these Heishou back-to-back especially has helped you realize how objectively similar they are, because I can't be bothered to be mad at this ID after everyone else. I just feel nothing because it's the same shit. However, it is worth mentioning at this point that outside of recurring events like Walpurgisnacht and the TKT/murder reruns, we only got 4 banners that had 2 IDs this season. All 4 of them were seasonal, and 3 of the 4 were Heishou banners, including this extremely random one with Adept Heath and Wei Dawn at the end. Ultimately, it's good to get more IDs rather than less IDs. I'm not gonna take away points for that, but it's also just further proof of the unbelievable effort put forth by Project Moon to push the Heishou as a faction harder than any other faction before them. As an argument to what I'm saying, people have brought up the fact to me that there were factions with similar amounts of IDs to the Heishou before this Heath Dawn banner, so why wouldn't I have the same upset reaction towards those factions getting more IDs? Specifically, Season 0 factions like the Liu or W Corp and the Blood Fiends from Season 5. First of all, technically, this argument makes sense. A lot of the Liu IDs are just about stacking burn, and most of the W Corp IDs are just about building charge, kinda similar to how the Heishous are focused around Rupture. But the main reason why I don't mind is because in order to get 7 or 6 IDs total in their faction, it has literally taken them almost 3 years. The Heishou, in the past 8 months, has reached 9 total IDs, and went from having only 2 to 9 within 6 months, meaning that for the past 8 months, we've had, on average, over 1 Heishou a month. As for the Blood Fiends, there's 4 of them, and while they have similarities within their kits, the roles they fill within the Blood Fiend quartet are much more defined. I've gone completely off the rails from the main topic of Mao Branch Dawn. She's not the worst, but if she had been released as a random one-off banner, I would be a lot less forgiving towards her, especially because she perpetuates the Heishou gameplay loop while adding basically nothing of note besides a panic-type debuff. Now, if all of that didn't do anything to convince you of anything regarding how uninspired or relatively pointless some of the Heishou IDs are, that's fine. I probably can't change your mind, but I can keep talking. Lord of Hongwan Honglu is the epicenter of the Heishou mind virus that's turning all the branches gay, and it's pretty obvious that he is the reason why Project Moon committed so hard to the Heishou. First of all, for lore purposes, a lot of the family hierarch candidates are likely just straight up dead in his mirror world, and that is a pretty fair reason as to why we didn't get an ID for some of the other candidates. Except it really isn't. Ji-chun Ishmael dies within the mirror worlds. However, we still got an ID for her before she died. Dayu Ryoshu is from an entirely different mirror world from everything else in Season 6, meaning we could have very easily gotten more IDs from this mirror world, but no. Instead, it's more Heishou, and it's just because Hongwan Honglu synergizes with the Heishou, and I can't even lie, it is cool. Answer Me Heishou Packs is probably the skill that can do the most in the entire game. Activating a bunch of skill 3 effects while doing good damage on its own, and with unique animations to boot. I'd have to be a real stickler to say that there's absolutely no appeal here. However, it really feels like in order to try and make Hongwan Honglu the coolest, greatest, baddest, endest, ideest yet, Project Moon felt they had to go all out on a faction that didn't really justify the hype on their own. Within Canto 8's story itself, the Heishou are a plot device with the exception of Zilu and Wei, and even then, Wei just gets shit on by Lei Hang. And speaking of Lei Hang, Meursault's idea of him feels like the best this season has to offer by far, because unfortunately, the other named IDs are either ones I don't care too much about mechanically, or get outclassed by Heishous due to being Rupture but arguably done worse. Both of these arguments are, of course, firmly rooted in my subjective bias, and I can't say for sure which between Dayu or Mao Ryoshu is better, but my gut instinct says Mao, and that really sucks. Again, I think a lot of the appeal of Limbus is meeting characters in the story and then getting to use their IDs. With the Heishou, the appeal seems to revolve around Hongwan Honglu, or the fact that you just really like the Heishou conceptually. And don't get me wrong, Honglu is cool, but if he ever gets outdated, then the Heishou themselves don't really stand on their own as unique IDs besides the 3 Adepts. The fact IDs of named characters were mostly brushed aside in favor of generic grunts who primarily justify their existence to fuel another ID's gimmick really concerns me for the future of the game. And in fact, it even makes me miss the way they handled Manager of La Mancha Land Don Quixote, even though I also criticized that at the time. This is like if Manager Dawn synergized with generic third kindred blood fiends that weren't shown on screen instead of the priest, barber, and princess. I'm pretty sure everyone would have been upset if we didn't get those IDs and instead just got Blood Fiend number 3. Now, I know how this looks. I just like complaining, so this video must have been a blast. But no, really, I don't enjoy being negative in this way. Because there's really no nice conclusion to be reached here. There's no constructive criticism that can break through, especially since it feels like most people were perfectly satisfied with the amount of Heishou IDs we had, and some people wanted more. If I had to concisely pack all of my criticisms of the Heishou into a package, it'd be by separating them into two categories: real Heishou IDs and mental illness. Wu Branch Song and Mao Faust are the only real Heishou IDs if I'm being really harsh. And I'd begrudgingly extend the honor to C. Roja and Yu Heathcliff if I had to allow some grunt IDs. This way we end up with no branch overlap and an even ratio of actual characters to randos. A team of these 4 Heishou and Hongguan Honglu, plus Daiyu Ryoshu and Jishun Ishmael, rounds out a rupture-focused Canto 8 team. Hongguan Honglu could maintain his Heishou gimmick here, or in a perfect world, he would get to use Deathrite synergy, because I think it was a neat concept on Kong Chu. Release some heavy hitter IDs like a Jupan Don Quixote, Night Drifter Sinclair for Spring Cultivation, and maybe that Shadow the Hedgehog looking guy whose name slips my mind right now for Gregor, and Season 6 just feels a lot more diverse. All we really lose out on in this alternate universe is more IDs that exist purely to feed the biggest, greediest bad end ID known to man, and even then, he still synergizes with the Jia family, and Daiyu Ryoshu synergizes with him. Overall, if there even is a proper conclusion to draw from this poorly formatted rant, it's that all I really want is for Season 7 to return to the more traditional format of previous seasons. Since even though Canto 8 didn't give us IDs of the characters I wanted to see more of, it is still my second favorite Kanto overall. And I'm hoping that if you came to this video with the utmost intentions to just call me an idiot who doesn't get it, that you at least understood that one of my points had some semblance of logic behind it. And hey, even if you still think I'm stupid after watching this entire video, these are just IDs. And like I said at the start, you are more than welcome to love all of these stupid fucks to pieces if you wish. They're just hardly my cup of tea. 'Cause they suck, and I hate most of them, and like I said, they don't have a reason to exist, and they ruin the sanctity of seasonal IDs, and why is my voice fading out? What the fuck is happening? I was not done speaking. Either way, thank you for watching. Once again, I'm sorry I was gone so long, but I'm hoping this video will hold people over until my next upload, the idea for which is already down on paper, or well, the modern day equivalent to paper. And speaking of paper, I actually got sent a letter from the Lord of Hongguan himself not too long ago. I've been waiting to see what it says inside, and yeah, let's open it up. Okay, Dear Escu, 我明来打死你了. Huh, it's a real shame I can't understand Chinese.